All right. So, as we normally do in getting ready for a quiz, we do a preview that looks a lot like it. The quiz itself won't be quite this long, but the different types of questions are all fair game. So we are going to do half of these together, and then I'm going to set you on your own for the other half. So I'm going to start on the evens with these. So again, a couple of things to remember. Absolute value. Remember, with these, there are going to be two answers. You're like, well, wait a minute, it looks like an equation. Why is there going to be two answers? Because remember, the absolute value means I have both a positive and a negative half of this. So when I'm doing them, what we were doing before is we'd split them up into two separate equations. The first time I just dropped the absolute values with things. And the second time, the only thing that's going to change is my answer. Now I still got to solve both of them, but I will get both the answers this way. So once I get that set, my whole job's just to undo whatever's with x. So I can undo the minus 2 by adding it. And I can get my two answers that way. And anywhere all the way down, wherever I have an absolute value, I'm always, on the first one, just going to write what I see minus the bars. Second one, I'm just going to change the answer to negative. So to undo my multiplying by 9, I'm going to divide by 9 to both sides in each of them. Uh-huh. And I get that ready to go. So it's as straightforward as just basically changing the answer once my absolute value is by itself. Now the only thing that can twist this up a little is going to be, keep it the same, change my answer on the second one. And again, you've got notes on these too, so it's not like, you wouldn't have an example to use when we do get to the quiz. This one, though, is going to have two steps. I've got to undo the positive 8, so I'd minus 8. But there's still a negative in front of my x. And that's something I'm going to have to deal with. Because now x isn't quite by itself yet, and I'm not adding a negative 1, or I'm not subtracting, I'm multiplying a negative 1 times x. So my opposite, or to undo a multiply, I'm going to divide. And then I just got to make sure my signs are right. Negative divided by a negative is a positive. Same thing over here. And I get my two answers, and I go on to the next one. So the biggest thing with these is just going to be remembering there's two answers, and that you don't just do one and then stop and go, oops, I only got half the answer, I'm only going to get half the credit. So that's kind of where we're at.
If it was minus 8, why you minus 8?
Well, because this is a positive 8, so sort of think of it that way. If it's positive, what would be the opposite? It'd be like a negative. Yes. So that's kind of, but that's why you'd want to do that instead. It actually is for once. That's kind of surprising.
It's hot.
So let's see what else we got here. Let's bounce back and forth a little bit.
Huh? Who knows, but I'm just kidding.
It's up.
Let's take a peek here.
That's no.
Same idea.
Uh-oh. Not very-
Copy the first one. And the second one, I just changed the answer.
This homework,
Yes.
it's not easy.
That's why we're doing a big chunk of it together. So what would I have to do first on either of these to start getting my 9n by itself? How do I add 1?
I want to like 5 minutes.
Oh dear.
I'll work. If I lost that.
Now it is possible on some of these to get a decimal. I don't mind if you even leave it as a fraction. Because now all I got left is to undo my times 9, which is divide. If it goes in evenly, that's all good. 72 divided by 9 is 8. But if it doesn't, I don't care if you put the decimal. I'm just not used to doing the decimal, so I'm just going to leave it as a fraction. So all we're going to do, again, whenever we see that absolute value, is we're going to continue to split it into two equations and just change the answer to a negative with my second one. Sometimes it may be 1 step, sometimes it may be 2, it varies. But sort of like what we did back on that front side, the one that Colby asked about, again, remember, this is a positive 8, and you want to think of undo, you want to think of the opposite of that positive 8. And that's always going to be my first job. My first job is to get my variable term, in this case my negative 2r, by itself. So once I do that, by minusing the 8, then I can go ahead and get that last step done. And again, to me, this is one of the trickier ones that you run into, because you see that minus there, or that negative, and you keep thinking, well, the opposite of minus is plus, and you want a plus. But that's not it. Because the minus isn't between these, it's right here. So this is negative 2 times r, and to undo a times, we're going to divide.
Can I answer the decimal?
Yes. You can get a decimal every once in a while on these. So that'll get me set on both of those. Now, one thing we haven't had happen yet with these is where we haven't had the absolute value by itself yet. And here's what I mean. We're going to take a look at 11 and 12 here. Before I can split them in half, you have to have the absolute value alone. I'm even going to make a note of that here. Absolute value alone before you split it into 2. Because if I don't, my answer is going to get messed up. So like for instance, on number 11, I need this absolute value of b minus 1 by itself on that side before I split it into 2 equations. Well, right now it's being divided by 8, so how would I undo it? How do you undo divide? Multiply. Okay, so whatever that number is, I'm just going to cancel that out. So this is what I get to after that. Now it looks like the other ones we've been doing. Now the absolute value is on a side by itself. So now I'm ready to split them in half. And again, the only difference is that the second one gets its sign switched. But now as far as the equation itself goes, it's pretty easy. If I want to get b alone, and I'm subtracting 1, to undo it, I'm going to add 1. And I just got to be careful with my signs on the second one. If I owe somebody $40 and I pay them 1 back, now I only owe them 39. So whenever you see something outside your absolute value, that has to get taken care of first. Otherwise, it just gets into all sorts of trouble. So something kind of similar is going to happen on 12, except here's the difference. Here's my absolute value. This time I'm multiplying by 4. Well, I got to undo that. So I undo the multiply by 4 by dividing both sides by 4. Okay, I'm not splitting it yet. I'll do that in a minute here. So once I get it split, once I get that absolute value alone, now I can break it into the 2 pieces and get my answers. And the only thing, again, we don't change what's inside the absolute value. The only part we're going to change when we split is that second answer becoming negative. Once I get it isolated, and then once I get it split, what's my undo going to be this time? How am I going to get my x alone here? Okay, we're going to divide by that -8. Nice thing about these split equations is I do the same thing to both of them. And I can get my answer. So that's the one thing to be careful of with these. And again, I'll kind of leave you for those other couple. So that basically gets us through what we'd be doing with all of our absolute value equations, okay, and trying to get those set. When we get to the other side, it says solve each compound inequality and graph the solution. Okay, we'll make a couple of notes here up the top to help us remember some stuff. So if it's just less than or greater than, that's going to be an open circle. If it's or equal to, that's going to be closed. The other thing I got to remember is what direction my arrow is going to go. So remember, if x is being eaten by the arrow, and again, it doesn't matter which side the arrow is on, this means greater than. When x is eating the arrow, my arrow is going to go to the right. If the arrow is pointing at x, and again, that can be either way, that's why I put them both down, that's less than, my arrow is going to go to the left. So for each of these, sometimes I may only have 1 to work on, sometimes it may be 2. So like for instance here, and I wish I'd have put my graph down a little bit further, but that's okay, we'll work underneath it. I'm going to take each of these and solve them separately. And the or should give me a clue here. The or typically means that my arrows are going to be going away from each other. So I get this first one, and I'm like, okay, I got to undo -6, so I'm going to plus it. So I get my first one, and I go, okay, v is greater than or equal to 8. I see the or equal to, lets me know that's a closed dot. Okay. Arrow is eating v. Arrow's going to the right. All right. So then I say, but I remember, I still got this other one to do. So I go, okay, got to get v alone. Undo the -3. All right, I'm going to plus it. I look and I say, okay, there's a line under my arrow, so at -3, I'm going to have a closed dot. Arrow's pointing at v. I'm When it points at it, we're heading to the left, and it's just like what I thought it was going to look like, because ors typically go out or away from each other. So that was kind of cool. So then I'm like, okay, let's see what else is on here, because there might be some others that look different. Oh, number 3. Number 3 looks kind of different. Now this one's a compound inequality, and when I see a big one like this, that's an and. And typically the ands are the ones that look like barbells when I get done at the end. So I'm like, all right, get A alone in the middle. Right now I'm dividing it by 7. So I need to undo that not only in the middle, but also on the left side and also on the right side. So there's 3 parts to this one. The 7 in the middle just cancels it out and leaves me with A, my variable. 1 times 7 is 7. And 7 times negative 1 is negative 7. But now A is alone in the middle, so that's good. But when I go to graph them, I got to remind myself, I'm going to look at them a piece at a time here. So my first job is to look and say, okay, A is less than or equal to 7. Well, I see or equal to, so it's 7. I'm going to have a closed dot. The arrow's pointing at A, which means less than, just like it does here, which means that arrow is going to be coming to the left. But then when I switch it around and I look at the other half, I got to be a little more careful. I notice on the negative 7 there's no line underneath, so I'm going to use an open circle. But here A is greater than. The arrow is eating my variable. So this one goes to the right, and remember, if it's an and they come together, it basically just means we're going to color in the middle. And I need to color to show that. I can't just have the arrows going both ways and leave it, because then I'm like, well, does that mean it goes all the way through? Does it stop right here? What happens? So if I get an and statement like that, I'm just going to color in the middle, and that's, again, what it's supposed to look like. Now there's one more type that I can get with the ends, with the ands, I mean. Because you see the compound one, the big one, if I move down a little bit, this one says and, which again tells me it's probably going to be like the barbells work. But let's find out. So let's see here. I'm going to rewrite it underneath so I can see what I'm doing. And again, multiplying by 7, got to undo it. I'm going to divide by 7. I'm not dividing by a negative, so even though I see a negative there, I'm not going to flip my arrow. So x is greater than negative 8. No line underneath, so it's open. Arrow is eating the x, which means greater than, which means we're heading that way. Then I'm going to do my other one. Again, I'm just undoing to get x alone. I'm minusing 4, so I'll add 4. I notice at 6, no line underneath. Open. Arrow pointing at x, which means less than. And I see the crash would be coming. So I'm going to go ahead and color that in. The word in the middle matters. If it's and, we typically get these kind of barbells with everything colored in the middle. If it says or, they go out from each other. So just something for me to keep in mind. Just a little bit of a hint. Now let's see what else we got working here in the rest of this. Let me flip over. All right, we got more inequality stuff working here. Let's do a couple more of these. Let me find a couple that look like fun. 11 looks kind of interesting. 14 looks kind of interesting. And 7 looks kind of interesting. Let's see how these 3 go. Okay. Number 7. I see or in the middle. So again, kind of tells me they're going to be going opposite from each other. Now, on that first one, I got to undo times -3, which is to divide. What happens when you divide by a negative? Yeah, the sign switches around. And if I forget that, I'm going to get the exact opposite of the right answer. So again, if n is less than 4, open circle, less than, because the arrow's pointing at n, means left. So this other one, if I'm doing things right, probably is going to be going to the right. So let's see, undo +2, I got a -2. No flipping on this one. So n is greater than 10, no line underneath, it's open, and when the arrow eats n, greater than means we go to the right. So again, they go out from each other, which they're supposed to do when they're ors. So this is good. So a couple more here, because I just want to make sure we get all the twists and turns taken care of here. So number 11, let me get this one split up here. All right, first job, isolate my p. I'm minusing 8, so I'll plus it. And most of you, when you take your time and really think about it, do a really good job with these. It's when you go rushing through that you get yourselves in a little bit of trouble. And similar to what we had up in number 7, my last step here, because I'm multiplying by -4, that's not -4, it's multiply, so we're going to divide. And again, whenever you divide both sides by a negative, I have to flip the arrow around. So I'm noticing I got an open circle. My arrow is pointing at the variable, which means it's less than, so that would be going to the left. Now, I start to look, I'm like, okay, now what should this graph look like? Oh, it's and. And is one of those ones that normally looks like a barbell. So I think I got this. So again, get that p term alone first. +6, opposite is to minus, or do a negative. And this time, we actually get to do this twice, just like we did over on this other half. When I divide by a negative, I've got to flip the arrow around, because otherwise it'll look weird. Still no line underneath my arrow. Haven't had one in a while, so that'll be open. And when the arrow eats my variable, which it does here, we crash in the middle. But again, the only time I got to do the flipping is when I'm dividing by that negative. All right, last one that I'm in on. Again, isolate my x. So I'll undo the -3 by plussing it. And then I will undo my multiply by dividing. And we finally get one back with the line underneath, or equal to. So we'll color that in. Arrow pointing at x, which means less than. And again, I see my and, which means it'll probably look like a dumbbell here. Get my x term alone by undoing the +1. And this time, again, be careful. I'm dividing both sides by a negative, so my arrow has to flip. If I don't flip it, I'll have everything go in the same direction, and that won't be good. Open circle on -4. Arrow is eating x, which means we're going to the right. And just like we had suspected, we are going into barbell mode. The rest are yours to play with. And again, tomorrow's quiz, directions will be the same, types will be the same. Basically, you've got a copy of it, except it'll be a little bit shorter. So that's about it.